Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of George Hunter and the murder of William Wood in Dinnington, Northumberland in 1875. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. As some of you will know, I do like to include a little background information of those involved. However, on a few rare occasions this isn't possible as I am unable to find any details. Sadly, this is one of those cases where information about both George and William from their past has eluded me, so the information will be quite basic. George Hunter was around 23 years old in 1875, so would have been born in around 1852. He was a miner and worked at Burradon Colliery, and he had at least 2 brothers and 1 sister. William Wood, the victim, was said to be around 20 years old in 1875, so would have been born in around 1855. He was also a miner and worked at Dinnington Colliery. He had only been living in the Dinnington area a few weeks, having previously worked at West Sleekburn. On the 9th of December 1875, George and William, along with 2 other men by the names of Thomas and Robert, had been out shooting in the Dinnington area. I assume this was pigeon shooting based on the details of the guns they were using, which were mentioned at the inquest. The group were all on friendly terms and decided to go to the Cargate pub in Dinnington at around 5 p.m. I have not been able to locate this pub, however I have seen other articles suggesting that it may have been the White Swan Inn, but I don't think that this is the case, so if anyone knows any details about the Cargate pub, do please let me know. The 4 men spent a happy few hours in the pub drinking and talking, and all seemed to be getting along fine. A little after 10 p.m. they left the pub, now joined by 2 other men, Samson Mead and Thomas Thorne, and began walking towards Dinnington Church. It had been snowing while they had been in the pub, and once or twice William Wood had thrown snowballs at the others, but no bad words were spoken and all seemed to take it in fun. As they neared the church, they were met by the schoolmaster of Dinnington School, Mr. George Stoker, and this is probably the strangest part of the story. Mr. Stoker had been going round the town with the petition for the reprieve for Richard Charlton, who was the subject of last week's crime story, and Mr. Stoker asked the men if they would be prepared to sign it. All of the men, including George Hunter, signed the petition, and the schoolmaster went on his way, little knowing that in a few short weeks George Hunter would be in the same position as Richard Charlton was at that time. As the men reached Dinnington Church, Mead and Thorne left them and went to their homes, which were close by. The rest of the group carried on towards the school, with George and William a little behind Thomas and Robert. A few moments later, as Thomas and Robert reached the school, they heard George shouting, "If you didn't stop messing, I will shoot you." They then heard William say, "You wouldn't shoot Geordie." Just after this, they heard the sound of a gunshot from behind them. It was immediately after this that George ran up to Thomas and Robert and asked for the powder flask. He was asked what he had shot at, and he calmly said he had shot William. The men could not believe what he was saying, asking him, "You shot Willie?" To which he replied, "Yes." They both quickly turned and ran back towards the church, with George following behind. They found William lying on the ground near the churchyard wall. It was later described as him being on his hands and knees with his face in the snow. Thomas attempted to lift him up to ask if he was badly hurt, but quickly realised that he was not actually conscious. Thomas then ran to the house of P.C. Davison to tell him what had happened. At the same time, Robert ran off in the direction of Seatonburn to find Dr. Walker. Dr. Walker, however, was already in the area attending to another patient and was quickly found and went to the aid of William Wood. On examining William, Dr. Walker quickly realised that he was already dead. Lying next to him in the snow was George Hunter. It appears that after the other two men had left, he had fainted. P.C. Davison roused him and then took him into custody for the willful murder of William Wood. When he was charged, he claimed that he could not remember anything about it. The body of William was taken to the nearby Bay Horse public house, where the inquest would later be held. When Dr. Walker examined William, he found the left side of his chest was riddled with shot from the gun. Later that same night, George was taken by cart to the police cells at the Moot Hall in Newcastle, where he would be kept until the inquest. The inquest took place, as already mentioned, at the Bay Horse pub in Dinnington. Robert and Thomas both spoke of the day being one of friendship and good humour. Robert gave the most information. He said he had seen William throw snowballs at Thomas Thorne, but he had not seen him throw any at George Hunter. He said he did not feel that any of the men that night were the worse for drink. He himself did not drink. He said that after they had heard the gunshot, George had ran up to them, but did not seem agitated. In fact, he seemed to be quite calm. He said after finding the body of William, Thomas had gone for the police and he had gone for the doctor, and he said that he had not returned to Dinnington that night. Christopher MacDougall said he was a mole catcher and lived in Dinnington. He said he was leaving his house at the time when the men were near the church. He believed that he had heard someone say, "Take a shot," then a reply of, "You won't shoot, will you?" And just after this, he had heard the sound of a gunshot. Superintendent Taylor said he had visited the area the following day. He said the area around the church wall showed signs of a gun having been fired, and that there were still signs of blood in the snow, and that the church wall was marked with gunshot. He believed that William must have been facing George when he had fired the gun, and the gun was believed to be a pigeon gun. The coroner stated that this was a strange case. It was evident that there seemed to be no real motive for the crime, and that throwing snowballs did not seem to be a good reason to shoot an unarmed man. William Wood had been the only man of the four who had not been carrying a gun. The jury at the inquest quickly returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder, and George Hunter was committed for trial. He would now be taken to Morpeth Prison to await his trial. The funeral of William Wood took place at Dinnington Church on the Sunday afternoon. It was said that upwards of 1,500 people had attended. He was said to have been buried only yards from where he had been killed. It was also stated that his mother had been deeply affected by the loss of her son. She had visited the Bay Horse pub many times to view his body, and even when the coffin had been closed and sealed for burial, she had wanted to go back again. It was only the kindly words of the vicar, the Reverend Churton, that had persuaded her not to open the coffin again. It was said that plans were put into place after the funeral to raise money to place a headstone on the grave. However, I found no evidence that this actually happened, and I was not able to find any trace of a headstone on my recent visit. However, I wasn't able to check the entire churchyard as the grass was soaking wet, and so, sadly, were my feet, so I had to stop looking. The trial took place at the Moot Hall in Newcastle in March of 1876, and when asked how he pleaded, George replied firmly, "Not guilty." Thomas and Robert gave the same evidence as that which they had given at the inquest. Christopher MacDougall also gave the same evidence, only adding that he had also gone to see what had happened to William, and was with Thomas and Robert when his body was found. Thomas Thorne stated that William had indeed thrown a snowball at him, but it had only been in fun and he had not taken any notice of it. He said until the time he left the group to go home, no cross words had been spoken between any of the men. Samson Meade gave similar evidence, stating that he had seen William throw the snowball at Thomas Thorne. He did not believe anyone else had been throwing snowballs, and he too thought that it had all just been in fun. Ruth Bell said she was the landlady of the Cargate public house. She said the men had drank 7 or 8 pints of beer each, and as far as she could tell, they were all sober when they left her pub. I have to say here that she must have been used to people being very drunk, as I am sure someone who had drank 7 or 8 pints would not appear to be sober to most people. George Stoker said that he had met the men that night and had spoken to them about the petition for Richard Charlton, which they had all signed. He said they seemed to be in good spirits, joking with each other, and he said that George Hunter did not appear to be drunk and spoke quite sensibly to him. Dr. Walker said the cause of death for William Wood was loss of blood due to the gunshot wounds. He said he had taken a great many of what were called at the time shot corns from the body, 48 in total, some of which had reached as far as the heart. He also said his shoulder was badly damaged and that he had wounds to his face that he believed had been caused when he fell forward into the snow. P.C. Davison said he had found the body of William lying in the road beside the church. He said he also found George Hunter lying on the road close by. He said his gun was standing beside the wall. He also called this a pigeon gun, and he had checked it over and believed it had been recently fired. He said on rousing George Hunter, he had refused to speak to him and would not reply to any questions that he put to him until he was charged, when he had stated he did not remember anything. George Hunter did not give any evidence at the trial. Mr. Greenhow for the prosecution said the main thing the jury had to decide was whether or not the gun had been fired by accident. He believed that had this been the case, then the prisoner would have said so either on his arrest or at a later date, but he had not done so, and the gun had been fired immediately after George had threatened to do so. The jury must also decide if there had been any provocation, and in his mind throwing snowballs could not be seen as provocation enough to shoot someone. After all, George was not in any fear or any danger at the time. It was, it seemed, a motiveless crime. The defence stated that George and William had been good friends and that there was no evidence of premeditation to suggest that George had willfully intended to shoot his friend that night. They had, prior to the incident, all been laughing and joking together, and although he did not wish to suggest that George was drunk at the time, they had all been drinking, so he did believe that he would be under the influence, and it was possible, in his opinion, that he may have forgotten that his gun was loaded when he aimed it at William. The defence went on to state that he hoped that the jury would see some reasonable doubt in this case, and that they would acquit George of all charges. The judge, in summing up, stated that he found it hard to believe that someone would threaten to shoot another person with an unloaded gun, as he could see no reason why anyone would do this, so it must have been known to be loaded. He said it was for the jury to decide if George had intended to shoot William at the very moment when he had pulled the trigger. Even if there had been no ill feeling between them previously, this was still willful murder and no premeditation was required. The jury retired for 45 minutes, and on their return they stated that by a unanimous vote they found George Hunter guilty of willful murder, but with a strong recommendation to mercy on account of the slight provocation and of his previous good character. The judge then sentenced George Hunter to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Morpeth Prison. The judge also stated that, along with his notes and the evidence from the trial, he would send details of the jury's recommendation for mercy to the Home Secretary. George was then removed from the dock and returned to Morpeth Prison to await his fate. I did not find any details of George saying anything in relation to the sentence. In fact, it seems that George did not speak at all at the trial other than to enter his plea. And the date for execution was set for March the 28th, 1876. The reports were indeed sent to the Home Secretary. However, it would seem that these had not been very helpful for George's case. It was noted that George's character was not as good as the jury had thought at the time of the trial. He had previously shot at 2 other people, and only 2 days before he had shot William, he had threatened to shoot another man if only he had had a gun with him at the time. Based on the details from the trial and this new information, the Home Secretary said there were no grounds to reduce the sentence to one of penal servitude, and that the execution of George Hunter would go ahead as planned. However, it took longer than usual for this news to reach the prison, and it would not be until the Sunday, 2 days before the execution was due to take place, that George found out there would be no reprieve. During his time in Morpeth Prison, George was said to be a quiet character, spending most of his time reading the Bible and listening to the Reverend Gray on his frequent visits. He had also had several visits from family members, always under the watchful eye of the prisoner governor, Mr. Wookey. Usually it would be one of the warders who stayed for the visits. However, in Morpeth it always seemed to be Mr. Wookey who would be there. George's parents, sister and 2 of his brothers visited him on the Tuesday, and it was said that George was very upset during the meeting, and he also stated that he hoped his sad position would be a warning to his 2 younger brothers. It was said that they would be allowed to visit him one last time the following Monday. On the Wednesday he was visited by his aunt, his cousin and her husband, but no details were given of this meeting other than who was there. And it would seem that on the final visit, his parents, brothers and sister, along with several other family members, all visited, and it was said to be a very short visit, with all being too upset to speak very much. And it was said that unlike Richard Charlton, who had been resigned to his fate, George had not wanted to die. He had hoped right up until the last that he would have his sentence commuted to penal servitude. William Marwood was again to be the executioner, and he arrived at Morpeth Station at around 6:15 p.m. on the Monday evening. Here he was collected by the prison governor, Mr. Wookey, in a carriage and taken immediately to Morpeth Prison, where he would spend the night. It was said that the execution site would be the same as had been used for Richard Charlton, as it was felt this was the most private spot within the prison, where it could not be seen from the high vantage points surrounding it. The pit, which had just recently been filled in, had to be dug out again and the gallows rebuilt over the pit. It is possible that the Photo 1 screen shows this location, as it is one of the most hidden areas in the location where the prison once stood. It was said that the night before the execution, George had slept well and had awoke at around 6 a.m. After eating what was described as a light breakfast, he then went to the prison chapel where prayers were read by the Reverend Gray. This continued until around 10 minutes to 8, when Mr. Wookey arrived to take him to the cell where William Marwood was waiting for him. Here he was pinioned, which means that his arms would be tied at the wrists, and he was then led towards the gallows. It was said that George, although having been very upset earlier, had walked calmly and firmly towards the gallows, which were only 20 yards away from the pinioning room. Once on the drop, Marwood placed the white cap over his head and adjusted the rope. The signal was given and the bolt was removed, and George fell. The black flag was raised above the prison walls at 8 a.m. to allow those outside to know that the execution had taken place as required by law. It was stated that around 200 people had been present outside the prison to witness the flag being raised, and afterwards they quickly moved on. No press had been admitted to the execution, and it was left to the prison staff to give details of what had happened. Most reports stated that George died almost instantly. However, a rumour circulated afterwards that the execution had not gone according to plan, and that George had struggled a lot, and that one of those watching had actually fainted. However, we have no way of knowing for sure which of these stories was actually true. But whatever the case, after the usual time of 1 hour, the body of George Hunter was removed and placed in a plain wooden coffin, and this was later buried in the grounds of Morpeth Prison. It was said to be buried end to end with that of Richard Charlton, who had been buried there only a few months before. This to me seems like a really strange story. It is truly tragic that something so simple as throwing snowballs seems to have led to the death of two young men, both with all their lives ahead of them, but it certainly feels like one where drink was involved once again. No matter what the landlady of the pub said, I cannot believe that all of the men were sober after drinking quite so much. But what do you think? Was it really just throwing snowballs that led George to shoot William? Or was it just in his nature, seeing as it came to light later that he had shot at and threatened two other people in the recent weeks before the murder of William Wood? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I personally can't help thinking it was something he would have done anyway, and the amount of drink he'd had in the pub earlier that night would not have helped. He seems to have been what some might have called hot-headed. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon. And as always, please do accept my apologies for my mistakes. I do try to correct them, and I do hope that it doesn't spoil your enjoyment of the story. Thank you for watching, and see you again soon.